In the early years of World War II, the skies over Europe became a proving ground of national pride, industrial power, and engineering ambition. Every nation believed its aircraft represented not just machinery, but identity itself. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel, like it, spread the word, and tell us where you're watching from. The Germans had their sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s and their aggressive, knife-edged Focke-Wulf FW-190s. These aircraft were sharp, fast, and deadly, symbols of a Luftwaffe that still believed itself unmatched in aerial combat. Against these, the introduction of a new American fighter seemed almost laughable. Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, when it first appeared, was not love at first sight. Allied pilots saw a giant, a machine so large it looked as if it belonged on a bomber roster rather than among nimble fighter escorts. Its fuselage was thick, its profile ungainly, and its weight, nearly twice that of many contemporary single-engine fighters, earned it a reputation before it fired a single shot. The nickname spread quickly, the flying bathtub, and behind that name, smirks and shaking heads. For many pilots, especially those transitioning from the more graceful P-40 Warhawk or the earlier P-39 Airacobra, the Thunderbolt seemed almost absurd. The cockpit sat high and rounded, giving the plane a bulbous, almost cartoonish silhouette. Some swore that the aircraft looked more like a metal barrel with wings than a war machine designed for the grace and violence of air-to-air combat. Even American maintenance crews joked that the plane must have been designed by someone who had only ever seen a fighter described over the telephone. Word of the new heavyweight fighters spread quickly across the English Channel. German pilots, proud and confident, laughed when they received their first intelligence briefings about the P-47. They had already fought Spitfires, Hurricanes, and soon would face the faster, lighter P-51. The Thunderbolt, they were told, was huge, sluggish, and unsuited for a dogfight. Luftwaffe flight officers mocked it openly. One pilot famously compared it to a flying barn door, while another suggested it looked less like a weapon of war and more like something used to deliver mail to farmhouses. To the Luftwaffe, the Thunderbolt seemed like the worst possible idea of American over-engineering: too heavy, too big, too slow. But the mistake, unseen in these early assessments, was the Titan buried inside the P-47's rugged frame. Inside that flying bathtub was the heart of a monster, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an engine so powerful it could haul the Thunderbolt to high altitudes where other fighters struggled to breathe. And more than just power, the aircraft hid endurance, survivability, and a terrifying amount of firepower: 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, whose combined burst could shred metal, tear wings from fuselages, and turn fighters into falling debris in seconds. But at the beginning of its story, few knew this. Pilots training on the Thunderbolt found it heavy on the controls. It did not roll as quickly as the Spitfire. It could not climb in the sharp, spiraling arcs that experienced dogfighters depended on. The first impressions were discouraging. Many American pilots quietly wondered whether they had been assigned to fly the wrong machine for the war they were fighting. The skies over Europe were dominated by seasoned German aviators, men who had learned to kill in the skies of Poland, France, and Britain. Now American pilots would be expected to face these veterans while flying a machine that seemed, at a glance, unrefined and overbuilt. Still, the Americans learned. Slowly, they began to understand that while the Thunderbolt did not turn like a dancer, it dove like a thunderbolt, appropriately named. At high speed, its massive frame stayed together where lighter fighters would shear apart. In a dive, it became one of the fastest aircraft in the war. Where others relied on finesse, the Thunderbolt relied on force. But this revelation had not yet reached the battlefield. At this early stage in the story, the laugh still belonged to the Luftwaffe. The confidence of German pilots sat high. They believed themselves masters of the air, their aircraft elegant predators compared to the awkward American newcomer. In briefings and in hangars, German pilots smirked when the P-47 was mentioned. They felt certain that if they ever faced one, the encounter would be short and the Thunderbolt would fall. The Americans, for their part, took that doubt and wore it silently. Some feared the German expectations were correct. Others trusted that the designers must have known something they did not yet understand. But war does not allow doubt to linger. Combat would reveal truths no rumor could hide. And soon, the skies of Europe would change. The Thunderbolt, still largely untested in real combat, sat quietly on airfields while crews fueled it, checked lines, and prepared it for sorties that would soon define its legacy. The men who would fly it stood beside it, helmets under arms, staring at the machine with a mixture of uncertainty and curiosity. They didn't yet know whether they were looking at a flawed gamble or a sleeping giant. But history rarely announces itself in the moment. It arrives in sudden shifts, in single missions, in the shock of first impact. The stage was set. The Luftwaffe was still bold and sharp, its pilots seasoned and confident. The American fighter groups were learning, adapting, and preparing. And above them all, the silent promise of conflict waited like a storm at the edge of the horizon. The thunder had not yet cracked, but it was coming. In the next chapter, we fly into the mindset of the German pilots, the kings of the sky, men who believed themselves untouchable. Their pride, their doctrine, and their expectations will define the shock that follows when the flying bathtub reveals its true nature. Their confidence was not arrogance alone, but the result of victories, training, and years of air combat experience shaping them into formidable opponents. Now, before the P-47 ever fired a shot in anger, the skies over Europe were ruled by men who believed they were untouchable. To understand why German pilots laughed at the Thunderbolt, we must first understand who they were. The Luftwaffe of the early and mid-war years was not merely a fighting force. It was an elite fraternity forged in fire years before the Americans arrived in the West European theater. These men had learned to kill in the air long before the Thunderbolt left the ground in combat. They had fought over Poland in lightning strikes so swift that the world struggled to comprehend how quickly entire nations fell. They circled over France during the Blitzkrieg, where tanks and infantry rolled beneath them, and the air became a realm of swift judgment, kill or be killed. And most famously, they crossed the English Channel again and again during the Battle of Britain, dueling the RAF in desperate, swirling dogfights high above the countryside. German fighter pilots emerged from these battles not just trained, but blooded. Surviving such crucibles did something profound to a pilot. It forged a belief in one's own superiority, a belief that became cultural, structural, and personal. Inside Luftwaffe squadrons, kill counts were not hidden, they were celebrated. The tail of a fighter often bore victory markings, small symbols tallying the number of enemy aircraft shot down. In a world where reputation meant survival, these marks were more than paint. They were identity. Aces were treated like knights of old, respected, admired, and feared. Men like Adolf Galland, Werner Mulders, and Erich Hartmann became legends whose names echoed even among their enemies. Their skill was so revered that new pilots entering their squadrons often felt not anxiety, but awe. This culture shaped the mindset of the average German pilot. Confidence was not arrogance, confidence was proven. They had fought, they had won, they had survived. Added to this was the aircraft they flew. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was sharp, lightweight, and deadly, its engine a finely tuned instrument for climb and maneuver. The later FW 190 introduced new levels of roll rate and firepower, allowing German pilots to slice into formation attacks with brutal precision. The Luftwaffe pilots trusted their machines. They trusted their training. They trusted themselves. When the war began, the Luftwaffe held the skis in many theaters. Their kill-to-loss ratios were remarkable, sometimes 5-to-1, in places even 10-to-1. And so, when American pilots began arriving in England, the German pilots looked across the channel and saw not equals, but amateurs. Men who had never tasted real air combat. Men who had not survived years of attrition. Men who, at least in the minds of German aces, were not yet warriors. And when rumors of the Thunderbolt reached their briefings, it only reinforced their confidence. Reports described it as large, heavy, slow to climb, and lacking the agility prized in dogfighting. German flight officers chuckled during intelligence meetings. Some said the Americans were compensating for lack of skill with sheer mass of metal. Others joked that it must take half the fuel reserve just to get the P-47 off the ground. They saw its bulk not as armor, but as clumsiness. To them, speed and maneuver were the measure of a real fighter. Precision, finesse, the dance of angles and timing. In contrast, the Thunderbolt seemed almost crude. So German pilots continued flying with heads held high, their confidence solid. Their victories continued. Bombers fell to their guns. Spitfires and Hurricanes collided with them in spiraling battles. Ground crews loaded their fighters with ammunition while they swapped stories in sunlit airfields across France, Belgium, and Germany. If danger existed, it was distant. If defeat were possible, it had not yet tasted the air. But beneath this confidence lurked a quiet, growing pressure. The Americans did not come alone. They came with bombers, waves of them. B-17s and B-24s roared across the sky like moving fortresses, daylight raids shaking cities, industrial centers, rail hubs, and factories. To stop them, German pilots had to throw themselves again and again into massive formations protected by defensive gun positions. And while the Luftwaffe could tear through them, each victory came with a cost: a pilot lost, a veteran gone, a gap left behind. And the Americans kept sending more. The German aces noticed it first. The strain, new pilots, boys barely trained, began arriving to fill empty cockpits. Their hands shook on the controls, their landings were uneven, their eyes held no hardened steel. The Luftwaffe was not yet breaking, but hairline cracks were forming. Still, the pride remained. Still, the belief held firm. They had won before, they would win again. And when the Thunderbolt finally entered the skies in force, squadrons of them escorting bombers deep into German airspace, the Luftwaffe believed the encounter would simply become another tally mark, another demonstration of dominance. They would climb, engage, turn, outmaneuver, and destroy. So when the first formations of P-47s appeared above the European countryside, shimmering in the cold high air, German pilots rolled their fighters into attack with steady, confident hands. They were the kings of the sky. They believed the throne was secure. But thrones can shake, and kingdoms can fall. The next chapter will reveal the hidden strength inside the flying bathtub, the revelation that shattered laughter, the moment when German pilots realized the joke had never been on the Americans at all. The German pilots had confidence. They believed the skis belonged to them. And when they first saw the P-47 Thunderbolt in formation, that confidence remained unshaken. It still looked like a brute, still looked oversized, still looked like something that simply should not work as a fighter. But outward appearances have misled armies, civilizations, and warriors since the beginning of history. And in the case of the Thunderbolt, the joke was never in its shape. It was in the assumptions people made when they looked at it. Because hidden beneath its thick armor and rounded frame was a monster waiting to be unleashed. The heart of the Thunderbolt was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine that was one of the most powerful engines ever placed into a single-engine fighter at the time. While German fighters relied on liquid-cooled inline engines, machines that provided beautiful aerodynamics but were vulnerable to a single, well-placed bullet, the R2800 could keep running even when shot to pieces. A bullet that would kill a Bf-109 instantly barely slowed the Thunderbolt down. But the engine alone wasn't the key. It was the turbo supercharger buried deep within the fuselage and connected through a network of ducts and piping that allowed the P-47 to climb high and stay fast where many fighters gasped for air. Above 20,000 feet, where bomber crews fought for survival and the cold became a living thing, the Thunderbolt could still roar. The German pilots who mocked its weight did not yet understand the advantage it carried there. Altitude was life. And the P-47 owned altitude. But even altitude was only part of the beast's nature. The Thunderbolt was built like a fortress. Its armor plating protected the pilot. Its oil systems were redundant. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing. Its wings could absorb damage that would rip other fighters apart. To German pilots used to seeing opponents fall after short bursts, the P-47 was something new, a fighter that refused to die. And then there was its most defining feature: 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. 4 in each wing, 8 streams of fire that could tear apart aircraft, vehicles, supply trains, and even light armor. While German fighters often carried heavier cannons, they fired fewer rounds and were slower to aim. The Thunderbolt, however, unleashed a storm of metal, a river of fire so thick that pilots described firing the guns as if the sky itself had turned into a buzzsaw. One pilot put it simply, "When the Thunderbolt fired, nothing in front of it survived." But raw power alone does not win wars. It must be understood. It must be mastered. Early Thunderbolt pilots learned this through trial, error, and sometimes loss. They discovered that trying to turn with German fighters was suicide. The Luftwaffe excelled at tight horizontal maneuvering, so the Americans changed the rules. They focused on energy tactics, adopting the boom and zoom style perfected by pilots who understood that altitude equals stored power. Thunderbolt squadrons flew high above their German opponents. From that position, they would dive, accelerating to ferocious speed, strike with the overwhelming burst of 8 Brownings, and then climb back upward before the German fighters could react. The Thunderbolt didn't have to dance with the enemy. It struck like a hammer. Once pilots understood this, the transformation began. Confidence grew. The aircraft that had once seemed heavy now felt solid. The weight that had once seemed like a flaw now felt like protection. The size that once drew laughter now meant survivability and range. It could stay in the air longer, fly farther, escort bombers deeper into enemy territory, and return home with holes in the wings and smoke trailing behind it, yet still land. In briefing rooms across Allied airfields, the tone shifted, the doubts faded, the pilots began to talk differently. They spoke of dives so fast that the wings hummed like thunder, of German fighters breaking away, unable to match the descent, of strikes where a half-second trigger pulled shredded fighters into fragments. And still, across the channel, German pilots were unaware of the danger approaching. They still believed the lumbering American fighter was prey, not predator. They still believed they could dictate the conditions of every engagement. But the sky was changing. As bomber raids reached deeper into Germany, Thunderbolts began escorting in numbers. Their altitude advantage became apparent. Their endurance allowed them to stay longer, and perhaps most importantly, their pilots were no longer hesitant. They were ready. The first engagements, where boom and zoom tactics were executed correctly, sent shockwaves through Luftwaffe squadrons. German fighters dove to attack bombers and were met not by fragile escorts, but by diving thunder. The Thunderbolts did not turn to meet them. They fell upon them from above, guns blazing, tearing into formations with unstoppable momentum. German pilots felt something they had not felt in years: shock. This enemy did not break. This enemy did not scatter. This enemy hit back harder. American pilots, who had once questioned their aircraft, now trusted it with their lives. They learned to ride its strengths like a force of nature. They learned that speed gained in a dive could not easily be matched. They learned that if they kept the fight vertical, high to low to high again, the Thunderbolt was nearly untouchable. The respect that grew among American pilots spread quickly. Stories circulated between squadrons. Pilots began naming their aircraft, painting noses with teeth, lightning bolts, and fire. Maintenance crews walked with a different posture. The flying bathtub was no longer a joke. It had revealed its teeth. And as the Thunderbolt evolved from misunderstood giant to respected predator, the tension in the skies tightened. The Luftwaffe had not yet realized the depth of the threat, but they were about to. Because the beast was now awake. And soon it would fight. The war in the skies over Europe was entering a new and brutal phase. German fighter groups, once confident masters of the air, believed they understood every American aircraft they faced. The Spitfires were agile but fragile. The early P-38 Lightnings were fast but temperamental. The B-17s were tough but slow. And then came the P-47 Thunderbolt, heavy, wide-bodied, and seemingly too cumbersome to be dangerous. To many German pilots, the sight of one elicited a smirk, not concern. But arrogance is a dangerous instructor. It was the spring of 1943 when the Luftwaffe first clashed seriously, with Thunderbolts escorting American bombers deep into occupied territory. The German tactic was straightforward: dive from above, fire a tight burst, and break away before the escorts could react. Against lighter fighters, the hit-and-run strike had proven lethal. Against the Thunderbolt, it should have worked the same. It didn't. The engagement began high over the rolling fields of northern France. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses droned steadily eastward, engines thundering like distant drums. Surrounding them, flying slightly above and behind, were the P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group, men who were still learning what their aircraft was truly capable of. Captain Robert S. Johnson, a young pilot still earning his place among veterans, scanned the horizon. The sky seemed calm, too calm. Then the radio crackled with a sharp, familiar warning. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Dark specks appeared like flecks of ash against the sun. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, diving fast. The Thunderbolts held formation. This time, they wouldn't scatter. The German leader, a seasoned ace with dozens of kills, expected the Americans to panic. He rolled smoothly into his attack dive, nose down, guns primed. His wingmen followed in perfect discipline. The closing speed was enormous. Distance collapsed in seconds. But instead of pulling defensive turns, the Thunderbolts did something unexpected. They turned into the attack. In a perfect, fierce maneuver, the entire escort flight rolled their heavy fighters and unleashed controlled bursts. 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns each, over 60 guns firing in a single blazing sweep through the sky. The air turned to lightning. A German pilot, confident he would shred the first P-47 in a clean pass, was suddenly blinded by streams of tracer rounds. His canopy shattered. The engine erupted. His aircraft spiraled into smoke and flame. The Luftwaffe leader felt cold shock. This was not a sluggish, vulnerable machine. This thing bit back. The dogfight exploded into a swirling clash of speed and fire. German fighters tried to turn inside the Thunderbolts, only to find the P-47 could dive faster, climb harder, and withstand punishment their lighter aircraft could not survive. A Messerschmitt scored a tight burst into a P-47's wing, but instead of tearing apart, the Thunderbolt held steady. Layers of armor and dense construction absorbed the impact. And then the American pilot rolled into a steep dive, a dive no German fighter could follow without risking structural failure. The Thunderbolt plummeted, gaining deadly speed. It pulled up behind its attacker, guns roaring. Tracers tore across the Messerschmitt's fuselage, ripping it open. The plane fell away like a broken branch. Captain Johnson, who only weeks earlier had been warned not to overestimate the P-47's abilities, now felt something new settling in his chest, a rising certainty. The Germans tried to regroup. They had come expecting an easy kill. They were now in a fight for survival. A Focke-Wulf pilot, his aircraft painted with the emblem of a veteran squadron, dove at a Thunderbolt from behind. He fired a burst, sparks spiraled from the P-47's tail, but the American fighter did not falter. With almost impossible poise, the Thunderbolt rolled, dove, then climbed in one continuous motion. The WWII pilot tried to follow and stalled. The P-47 came around like a hammer swinging through the sky. 8 guns answered. The German fighter disintegrated. The sky flashed with burning metal and falling wings. The engagement lasted minutes. The implications would last years. When the Luftwaffe finally broke away, smoke trails hung in the air like scars carved into the sky. The Thunderbolts reformed, engines steady, their massive silhouettes glinting in the morning light. The B-17 formation continued untouched, not a single bomber lost. The pilots who returned that day were changed men. They had seen what their aircraft could do when used with discipline and understanding. They had felt the momentum of the dive, the shudder of the guns, the sudden silence after a kill. Confidence settled into them as certainty earned in combat. The Thunderbolt had not just protected the bombers, it had dominated the battlefield. Yet the Luftwaffe was not broken, not yet. The German High Command began analyzing engagement reports, reviewing flight recordings, interviewing surviving pilots. They sought weaknesses in the Thunderbolt's pattern. They believed that somewhere, hidden within its strengths, there must be a flaw they could exploit. This belief set the stage for a new phase of the air war, one defined not by quick encounters, but by strategic adaptation on both sides. The next time Thunderbolts and German fighters met in force, it would be a test of will. After the first shock of the Thunderbolt's true power reverberated through the Luftwaffe, something subtle yet unmistakable began to shift in the skies over Europe. The German pilots who had once approached American formations with swagger now approached with calculation. The Thunderbolt was no longer dismissed as a clumsy giant. It had become something far more dangerous, an opponent that could not be underestimated. American pilots, meanwhile, had found their rhythm. The lessons of boom and zoom combat were now doctrine. The Thunderbolt's immense engine power and aerodynamic stability in high-speed dives became the fulcrum of every engagement. No longer trying to turn with the German fighters, P-47 groups mastered altitude supremacy. They flew high, higher than the Luftwaffe expected, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At 25,000 feet, with the sun blazing off polished aluminum and oxygen masks pressed tight to their faces, squadrons of Thunderbolts patrolled the sky like watchful giants. When enemy fighters attempted to climb toward the bomber streams, the P-47s would dive, closing distance with terrifying speed. There was no warning, only the growing roar, the glint of wings, and then the shattering storm of 8.50 caliber guns. The Germans, who survived these first strikes, spoke of them with hushed awe. "They came down like thunder," one pilot said. "You never saw them until they were already firing." This was the beginning of the Thunderbolt's reign. But air-to-air combat was only part of the story. As the Allied bombing campaign intensified, German logistics became the new battleground. Factories, supply deposits, rail hubs, and fuel convoys were the arteries that kept the war machine alive. Destroy them, and the Luftwaffe would weaken from within. Here the Thunderbolt revealed another aspect of its nature, its ability to carry ordnance. Unlike the lighter fighters that could only engage enemy aircraft, the Thunderbolt could carry bombs and rockets without compromising performance. It could escort bombers deep into Germany, then peel off to strike targets on the ground with devastating efficiency. P-47s began dive-bombing rail lines, strafing supply trucks, and blowing bridges apart. They hunted trains relentlessly, earning a new, fearsome nickname among German soldiers on the ground: the Train Busters. Entire rail networks were thrown into chaos. Supply columns were forced to hide in forests, cover roads with camouflage, and move only at night. And even then, the Thunderbolts came, swooping low, engines screaming, wings almost scraping treetops as they delivered destruction in precise, merciless passes. The Thunderbolt's rugged construction made it nearly indestructible at low altitude. Pilots returned to base with wings riddled, oil lines torn, tail sections nearly severed, yet the machine still flew. German anti-aircraft crews cursed the aircraft's durability. A direct hit that would destroy most fighters merely wounded the jug. And if it made it back to an Allied airfield, ground crews would patch it, refuel it, and send it into the sky again by sunrise. The Luftwaffe began to feel the strain. Veteran aces were lost, not to inexperience or mistakes, but to Thunderbolts that dove harder, climbed faster, and soaked up damage that German aircraft could not afford to take. Each loss was irreplaceable. The Luftwaffe's training program, once producing elite pilots, now rushed new flyers into combat with only minimal instruction. These young men climbed into cockpits carrying fear they tried desperately to hide. They faced American pilots who had now survived dozens of missions, who had mastered their machines, who understood the sky as hunters rather than prey. The Thunderbolt changed the psychology of the air war. German pilots no longer asked, "How many bombers are there?" They asked, "Are the jugs with them?" The arrogance that once defined the Luftwaffe had eroded. The sky was no longer theirs. Engagements were no longer chosen by them. Every sortie carried risk. Every encounter carried the possibility of sudden, violent death from above. And still the Thunderbolt evolved. Improved models extended range. Drop tanks, newly designed, allowed Thunderbolts to escort bombers all the way to the edges of Germany and return. No bomber was left unprotected. No German fighter could count on unchallenged airspace. The war that once felt like a contest now felt like inevitability. Yet the Jug story was not finished. As the months rolled forward, the Thunderbolt's presence became constant, inescapable. Civilians in occupied territories learned to read the distant thunder of its engine and distinguish it from the sharper snarl of German fighters. It was the promise that liberation drew closer. German troops on the front lines felt the same shadow press upon them. Armored columns that once advanced confidently now scattered when the sky darkened with the silhouettes of P-47s. Supply depots burned. Ammunition convoys erupted into fireballs. Communication lines snapped under repeated strikes. In briefing rooms across German airbases, squadron leaders spoke in new tones, less commanding, more resigned. The question was no longer how to defeat the Thunderbolt, but how to survive it, and survival was growing harder. For the Jug was not fighting alone. It was part of a vast and coordinated strategy, a relentless tightening of the air war. The Thunderbolt had helped shift the tide, and now that tide was rising. Europe's skis no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe, they belonged to the storm. But the true test was yet to come. The Thunderbolt would soon face new battlegrounds, new tactics, and new forms of resistance. The sky was conquered, but the war was far from over, for now. The war had changed. The skis over Europe were no longer the arena of German dominance they once had been. The Bf-109s and Fw-190s still flew, still fought, still clawed for control, but the balance had shifted. And at the center of this shift was the very machine that had once been the punchline of every Luftwaffe briefing room, the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Germans had laughed at it, truly laughed. They called it a flying beer keg, a tractor with wings, a blunt hammer. They sneered at its size, its weight, its shape. Everything about it looked wrong, inelegant, unworthy of the sky. But war is the ultimate judge, and the sky, though vast, has no room for illusions. Those who mocked the Jug had lived long enough to see their laughter die. The transformation was not sudden. It unfolded like a storm approaching from far on the horizon, first unnoticed, then undeniable. Stories began circulating among German squadrons, not rumors, reports, cold, factual, concerning. Do not engage them in a dive. Do not let them gain altitude. Do not approach them head-on. These were warnings, survival lessons. Veteran pilots who had carved their reputations during the Battle of Britain returned from sorties pale and shaken. They described Thunderbolts that refused to fall, even when smoking, leaking oil, or carrying damage that should have sent any aircraft spiraling to Earth. They described dive speeds that pushed the very limits of aerodynamics. They described the 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, not as weapons, but as scythes. One pilot said it plainly. You do not fight the Jug, you escape it if you can. The arrogance of the Luftwaffe began to crack. A battle near the Ruhr Valley sealed this shift in fear. A formation of B-17s was headed toward a critical industrial complex. A German squadron, experienced and confident, moved in to intercept. They had done this dozens of times. Bomber formations were big, slow, and clumsy, easy prey as long as the escorts were pushed away first. But on this day, the escorts did not break. The P-47s rose out of the high cloud layer like steel giants awakening. They did not scatter or flee. They did not try to turn with the German fighters. They held altitude, then dove. The sky lit with thunder. The German pilots expected hesitation. They expected disorganized defense. Instead, they were met with a coordinated strike. The Jugs tore through their formation with a controlled ferocity previously unseen. One burst, just one was often enough. Wings shattered, engines tore open. Aircraft simply came apart. The German squadron limped home, those who made it at all. After that day, Even the most decorated Luftwaffe aces stopped laughing. But the Jug's impact stretched far beyond dogfights. It became the bodyguard of the bomber crews, men who lived inside a world of flak explosions, shattered glass, and damaged engines. Before the P-47 arrived, bomber crews would whisper prayers before every mission. They knew many would not return. Then one day, they looked out their windows and saw thunderbolts flying in tight formation, sunlight glinting off their thick, broad wings like shields of steel. The bombers gained hope, and the Germans learned fear. Then came the low-altitude missions. Railways, convoys, fuel depots, communication lines, armored columns. Nothing was safe. When German soldiers heard the distant rumble of radial engines, they did not see a slow, clumsy giant. They saw an executioner. Asphalt roads became scorched ribbons along the countryside. Tanks burned where they sat. Trains lay twisted and broken along tracks. Supply movements became a gamble with death. The Jug had become a force of ruin. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't graceful. It was unstoppable. By the final year of the war, the Luftwaffe's confidence had evaporated. Survival, not victory, had become their measure of success. Aerial dominance had not simply shifted, it had collapsed in favor of the Allies. And the P-47 Thunderbolt had been instrumental in that collapse. The laughter was gone, erased, buried. Those who once sneered now spoke of the aircraft with respect, a respect earned not through appearance, but through reality. Because the Jug had proven a timeless truth. Strength does not always look the way we expect it to. Power does not have to be elegant to be overwhelming. And what seems heavy, slow, or unrefined may carry a storm inside it. For the pilots who flew it, the P-47 was more than metal, oil, and fuel. It was a guardian, a companion, a survivor. It brought them home when everything else tried to kill them. And when the war finally ended, the Thunderbolt stood among the most important weapons of the Allied victory, not because it was beautiful, but because it worked, because it endured, because it refused to break. The Germans had laughed once, but the sky has a way of revealing truth. And high above the clouds, where fire, steel, and thunder decide fate, the laugh died. Forever.